Hello,
Right.
everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm your host, James Doffinger Jr. This is episode 6 of James's interview series. And today, my guest is Pedro Gabriel. Did I say that right? And also, how are you doing?
Yes, it's okay. The Portuguese the way to say it in Portuguese is Pedro Gabriel,
Okay.
but it's okay. I am perfectly fine with it. I'm fine, thank you. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here on the show. and
Definitely. Yeah. I was about to say, I am so tremendously honored to have you on because you've been a big influence in my life, especially very recently, too. I'll get into that in a bit. But I want to read for everyone just a quick bio of yours. Let me pull it up here. So, Pedro Gabriel is a medical doctor. He is a Catholic layman and physician born and residing in Portugal. He is a medical oncologist currently employed in a Portuguese public hospital. A published writer of Catholic novels with a Tolkienite flavor, he is also a parish reader and a former catechist. He seeks to better understand the relationship of God and man by putting the lens on the frailty of the human condition, be it physical and spiritual. He also wishes to provide a fresh perspective of current church and world affairs from the point of view of a small Western European country, highly secularized, but also highly Catholic by tradition. And so, Pedro, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is just by way of my own personal history. One of the reasons why I am so tremendously honored and privileged to have you on, and I'm so excited, is that in my conversion, I came into the church in 2018 at the Easter Vigil, and it was a great experience. Like everything was great until about maybe mid to late 2018, when the sex abuse scandals of the Philadelphia grand jury report came out, and there was a massive dossier with all sorts of terrible, evil things, all these types of rapes and cover-ups. It's the rapes and stuff and molestations of children wasn't bad enough. It was that bishops at high levels covered it up and bought people out and bought hush money, which is terrible.
Yes.
And it really broke my heart. And at first, I sort of was like, okay, well, that doesn't mean the Catholic Church is wrong. It just shows that there's moral corruption, and there's been moral corruption in the church too before, like in the Renaissance papacy, the Medicis and the Borgias, where popes are having mistresses and orgies in the Vatican. So it wasn't really surprising to me historically, but still, nonetheless, I had to morally condemn it as a Catholic because it's not consistent.
Of course, as you should.
Yeah, definitely. And but then what happened, and just long story short, I started binge watching because I was more traditional Catholic, and I still am by persuasion, but I've become more nuanced in different things. But at the time, I was like binge watching stuff from Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon, from LifeSite News, from Church Militant, from The Remnant with Michael Matt, and from outlets like 1 Peter 5, Steve Skojec at the time, and all these other more like radical reactionary traditionalist types, some SSPX news outlets, things of that nature, and news outlets like the Fatima Center as well, which I think is more SSPX if I'm not mistaken. And so I basically became very suspicious of Pope Francis. I went in and out of believing that he was a heretic. There was the Easter letter that came out, of course, in April of 2019, I want to say, if I recall correctly. And one of the items in there, we won't go into all of that, but just the one specific item that's related to our show is on Amoris Laetitia. They said that certain paragraphs in that document from the Holy Father was heretical. And I was even tempted at times to look into sedevacantism, to Orthodoxy, even going back to Protestantism. And so this lasted pretty much for all of 2019, pretty much all of 2020. And it wasn't really resolved until earlier this year when a few things happened. One, I started to listen to more of Where Peter Is and read more of your guys' stuff, including yours. And even though this show is not about these books right now, but one thing that helped was Stephen Walford's book on Amoris. That really helped me, which, by the way, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, wrote the preface to this. And he argues, which is...
He wrote a letter for it, yes. And it's in that book.
Yeah, which is, that's amazing, which I do want to have eventually Stephen Walford on, because I'm Facebook friends with him. So, but I just want to leave that aside. So shout out to him.
He would be a very good person to interview. He is awesome. And that book is also very good indeed. I highly recommend it.
And one that really struck close to home was because I was not really expecting this. One of my favorite theologians, Matthew Levering, wrote a book on the indissolubility of marriage and Amoris Laetitia in context. And he defends Pope Francis as Orthodox. And he actually even says, it's kind of funny because, sorry for this long preface, but I just have to say this. But, it's funny because the Holy Father, when Amoris came out, he said, my doctrine is just St. Thomas Aquinas' doctrine. And Raj responded saying, no, it's not. You're lying and all this and that. And then Matthew Levering, who specializes in St. Thomas Aquinas, was like, actually, yes. So get this book. It's by Ignatius Academic. That was amazing. So, and of course, in 2018, this was before, of course, reading those two books, but I read Amoris Laetitia itself. This is the Vatican's translation. And so, Pedro, so getting into the questions now with that sort of background out of the way, I want to ask you, I think the first question will be this. What is Amoris Laetitia? Like, just start at that basic.
Okay. First of all, I would also like to add that what you felt in 2018, minus the sexual abuse, only the part about the doctrine, is something that I also experienced earlier on. I'm a cradle Catholic. I have a profound admiration for Benedict XVI. Yeah. I consider myself a Ratzingerian even now with Francis. Of course, I love Francis a lot, but I still feel myself more like a Ratzingerian in my approach to the faith, and that's okay. Everyone has their styles. But of course, so when Francis was elected, I was already Catholic, so I was already plunged into the turmoil of controversy. Mm-hmm. And I remember that even during the election of Francis, people were already anxious and very, very anxious, just because he chose a different name, which is associated with more liberal leanings, because he used a different kind of attire during his presentation at the balcony of St. Peter. And suddenly a lot of Catholic resources, websites, apologists, commentators were starting to get nervous and saying that he was heterodox, even before Amoris Laetitia. And of course, I also felt nervous and anxious. That anxiety that you felt, I felt it as well much earlier on. And I remember starting to read Laudato Si, because they were already saying that Francis advocated for population control and whatnot. And I remember going into the encyclical with that suspicion that you talked about, which these websites and these comments plant on you. And I was like, every paragraph I was saying, oh, it's going to be now, it's going to be now. and it never came. And I even was pleasantly surprised to see that Francis, in Laudato Si, condemned once more population control. And from that point onward, I remembered what I learned with Benedict XVI. When Benedict XVI, there was a media cabal, let's call it that way, to demonize him and always put him out of context, always say things say that he had said something wrong, planting controversy where there was none, making him sound like he was a kind of fundamentalist, fanatical, super extreme right-wing Nazi, whatever. And he is actually one of the most prolific intellectuals in the life of the church. He was pivotal during the Second Vatican Council. He is awesome. He's awesome, period. I remember that when I used to see the media comment on Pope Benedict, that I should go to the primary sources always. And with Francis, it has to be the same. We cannot go through the lens that other people try to we cannot let other people interpret Pope Francis for ourselves. We have to go and read him. When there's a controversy, go read his actual words. Go read them in context, and read Francis not only when he says something controversial, read him also on his day-to-day, so that you can start thinking you can start knowing and understanding how his mind ticks. And sometimes then something that he says is not surprising anymore. Now, so that's what I learned. And and that kind of protected me from the shock of Amoris Laetitia in 2016, because I knew that at that time they could not quite pin anything bad on Francis yet, even though they could say it was liberal, they could say it was left-leaning, but they could never say this is heterodox, because it was church social doctrine. It was only a matter of time until Pope Francis would do something that they could actually pin something on him. And the outlet came with Amoris Laetitia, because he then, in fact, did something that his predecessors had not done, which was change a sacramental discipline, and we'll get there throughout the interview. But so what is Amoris Laetitia? Pope Francis convened a synod about the family in 2014 and 2015. It was, if I'm not mistaken, the one of the first synod that he did, and it was a hallmark of his papacy, a more synodal church. We have now undergoing a synod on synodality. And Amoris Laetitia is the post-synodal apostolic exhortation. Pope Francis listened to the bishops during those 2 years, and then he wrote a document with his magisterial weight on it, commenting on the conclusions of that synodal process and teaching the church on faith and morals about this topic after he consulted all the bishops of the world, or many bishops of the world, on this specific topic. And so that's Amoris Laetitia. And one of the things that we need to understand is that Amoris Laetitia is not the 8th chapter. In fact, Pope Francis has expressed at least twice displeasure for the way that people have been focusing on the 8th chapter, because he wants people to read the whole document. He didn't. He wrote the 8th chapter. Then that means that there are at least 7 chapters before, and there's some chapters after.
Yeah.
So it's not because he just wanted people to focus on that specific chapter. People are focusing on this chapter because it's controversial, but the chapters, the other chapters are absolutely beautiful. There's that chapter that dissects St. Paul's anthem to love, right? And that's just beautiful, and we can learn so many things on our day-to-day life with that. I know for a fact, and most people might find it shocking, that Pope Francis abhors ideology. He is not an ideologue. So he always, I find that sometimes gets irritated because people will always focus on the parts of his teachings that they can try to construe to their political polarization, and that's not the way he wants. He doesn't want us to see Catholicism through the lens of ideology. He wants us to read our ideologies through the lens of Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
And one of many problems stem from precisely the opposite. Many of those Catholic commentators, Catholic websites, they have an ideologized view of the church, and they try to read Catholicism through that lens.
Yeah.
Pope Francis, I know that he doesn't like that. He doesn't like that. So he has said several times, and we as Catholics should filially try to obey in that. Try to read the Amoris Laetitia in its whole, from beginning to end, and try to learn and try to be transformed by the things that might appeal to you, not just the 8th chapter. The 8th chapter is mostly geared towards people who are in irregular situations and to those who actually accompany them. But you have other things as a married person or as a person who is on a date and gearing towards marriage, or as a father, or as a son, or as a mother and a daughter. You have many, or even just as a Catholic in the world, you have lots of things to learn about with Amoris Laetitia. And I think that that's the main lesson. I try to mitigate the controversy so that people might not be as anxious about the whole document, and that the beauty of the whole document might finally shine through. Because I do believe that the Amoris Laetitia has the possibility of becoming one of the pivotal and more important documents, papal documents in recent history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really excellent. I really appreciate you taking us to that sort of 30,000 foot view background for all that. That's really much appreciated. And it's very true what you say, because like in the document, reading some other examples too, if just going to the table of contents, there's so much stuff. It goes like, chapter 1, in the light of the word, you and your wife, your children are as the shoots of an olive tree, a path of suffering and blood, the work of your hands, the tenderness of an embrace. And he goes on and so forth. And there are 9 chapters, and then discussion questions, and then endnotes. And of course, I know there's the controversial footnote in chapter 8, which we will get to, but I do want to ask you my next question here. So I want to transition sort of more of your background with this as well. I know you've given us a lot, but tell us about, what is Where Peter Is, and why did you help found Where Peter Is in relation to, Amoris Laetitia and Pope Francis?
Okay, so I've been an apologist since the time of Benedict XVI. Okay,
Right, as you said, yeah.
I had a Portuguese website dedicated to debunking and refuting all the attacks against Benedict XVI. After Benedict XVI resigned, after Francis was elected, I kind of took a time out. Okay, so because I thought that that I could. It was also a more busy time of my life at the time. When I finished my medical degree and I was starting to my residency in oncology, those were rough years. But then I noticed that precisely what I talked about before, the fact that those Catholic apologists, those Catholic commentators, Catholic websites were suddenly doing is exactly the opposite that they had done with Benedict XVI. They suddenly were not defending the Holy Father anymore. In fact, while the secular media was mostly mild, they were actually the sources of those attacks, those confusions. And we waited. Me and the other authors of Where Peter Is, we waited for quite some time because we thought, okay, not everyone is like this. Okay, sooner or later, more people who are more moderate will notice that something is amiss and they will stand out. But the problem is precisely that the more we waited for the moderates to stand up and reclaim what they had been doing before Francis's election, what happened was that it started to fester, and even the moderates, supposedly moderates, were starting to acquire the tics and the expressions from the more radical attackers of the papacy, of Pope Francis, and finally we had to say enough is enough. Someone has to do something. There's a big void of people defending Pope Francis, and this happened precisely also during I think the end of the Obama age and starting of the Trump election. So the apologists that were less inclined to criticize the Pope, and actually the apologists that were defending the Pope were actually more, they were trying more to comment on American politics. Okay, so there was a kind of vacuum about people actually tackling in a systematized way, as before with Benedict they had. Oh, there's this controversy, and here's why it's wrong. Here's what people have been saying, and here's the proper context. And this probably led many people to lose their faith, or at least become anxious and to never again trust Pope Francis. So enough was enough. Me, Mike Lewis, and a few other guys, we met in some com boxes on Facebook. And we started thinking about, creating our own website dedicated to that. That's when Where Peter Is came forth, and here we are. Some of our most of our articles in the beginning were actually about Amoris Laetitia, because it was still the hot topic at the time. Then there came others. They have been piling up. But Amoris Laetitia was the one that actually started it, and regarding a need for an apologetics directed to the defense of Pope Francis. And there's Where Peter Is. He's one of the co-founders, and here we are.
Yeah.
So continue to do this work, okay?
Yeah, and you said Mike Lewis, correct?
Mike Lewis. He was the one at the head. He's always been our leader, the one who's at the head. So yeah, it's Mike Lewis.
Yeah, I really appreciate him. Me and him have had almost a 2 or 3 year Facebook message back and forth. So I feel kind of bad, and I told him this recently when I changed my mind earlier this year. I was like, sorry for you putting up with me being kind of a jerk, because I was still kind of more reactionary when we were dialoguing and talking about a lot of these things. And so he's been very influential, and he'll be on for a future show. But yeah, I really much appreciate everything you guys do at Where Peter Is. I first, I think I saw one of your guys' first posts in around 2018 or something like that. But
yeah, it was around that time. Yeah, it was around. Or yeah, it was around that time.
Yeah, because I was still very critical, antagonistic towards it. So it took me about 2 years or so to kind of come around, or I guess 3 almost.
Okay. Really. It's precisely one of the overtones of Pope Francis' papacy. Time is greater than space. So it does not matter the time you take. What matters is that you're going the right direction. In the context of Amoris Laetitia, I've read a fantastic sentence. I think it's from Rocco Buttiglione. It's precisely that. The direction of your pilgrimage of faith is more important than where exactly you are. Because if you make, and this is something that is actually, if you think about it, regarding those Catholic websites and commentators, they may be very advanced on the faith, but they're going in the opposite direction of what they should be going. So that's bad. That's worse than a person who's a very big sinner, but is starting to to do the first steps towards Christ. That's better. That's something that's even that God is more pleased with this person who is going in the right direction. So
yeah. I was about to say, and I think, we see that too in Scripture, the principle where Jesus talks about the parable of the tax collector, I believe, or the publican and the Pharisee. And the Pharisee is standing in the synagogue saying, Lord, I praise you that I'm not like this lowly sinner over here. And he's sort of self-indulgent in his self-righteousness. And then the sinner, the publican who knows he's a sinner, beats his breast, as the gospel says, and says, Lord, I'm a sinner, please forgive me. And I think really that kind of encapsulates like the heart of what Pope Francis's like theology of mercy is, and repentance.
Yeah. Even though in that parable we have no grasp of if the Pharisee is going in the wrong direction, he might just be stationary because he's very comfortable.
Right.
But we do have Jesus going to the sinners and people being very scandalized. These are sinners, but actually those sinners were walking towards Christ, even if at the time they were still imperfect, if they were still, they were still lame on their path of the faith. But Jesus preferred them rather than those who were more self-sufficient, more self-reliable indeed. So that's a cautionary tale. No matter how much we know, no matter how big we think we are on the faith, we will always need to be walking. The path is not done until that final day.
Definitely, yeah. That's really important, and it's like Jesus. I mean, he hangs out. I mean, I don't want to say hang out, but like he ministers to, prostitutes, tax collectors, and Gentiles, which that was a big no-no in those days in the first century.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. So I mean, there was some racial tensions between the Jews and like the Samaritans, which is why Jesus is like the Good Samaritan. By the way, this is the good guy in the story, in this parable, which is really like for that audience, it's like, wait, what?
That breaks completely the polarizations that people were used to seeing. And even the person who listened to the Good Samaritan parable knew when Jesus asked, who was this person's neighbor. It was the Samaritan. People can understand that. So this makes them think a little outside the box. They are forced to admit that it's that, even if they don't want to admit it. Yeah, that's what Jesus Christ does to us. He unsettles us. And so I think that if Pope Francis unsettles a person, that's good. That's good. The problem lies when people who are unsettled by Pope Francis suddenly think, oh, but this is Pope Francis's fault. It's not my fault. When Pope Francis condemns rigidity and whatnot, oh, here he goes again. I don't need to be less rigid. I'm fine as I am, and they express hurt, and I can sympathize with that. They express hurt about the way they're being treated by Pope Francis, but then there's just turn around and see the people who might have been hurt by the previous popes and their teachings on sexual immorality. Okay, those people are supposed to be unsettled because we have a great treasure to bring them on the sexual doctrine. It's supposed to be a treasure, the theology of the body of John Paul II. That's absolutely beautiful, but it will unsettle these people, and those people will sometimes feel hurt about it. So if we are the supposed people that are going to bring the gospel towards them, shouldn't we lead by example? I mean, we have to accept the possibility that we need to be corrected. And the church has a Thomistic theology still, okay, very much. And Thomas Aquinas was inspired by Aristotle. And the virtue ethics of Aristotle is not, oh, there's good and there's evil. No, Aristotle's ethics is usually you have one evil, you have the opposite evil, and the good lies in the golden mean. So, okay, you are not safe just because you're more rigid than those liberals over there. You might be going on the opposite direction. You must be willing to be corrected by the Pope, by the person with authority, saying you have gone overboard. You need to come back to the mean. You need to go back to the golden mean, okay? So if we're not able to accept ourselves to be corrected, how are we going, with what face are we going to go to those Gentiles over there, to those who are secularized, to those who are promised love, acceptance, tolerance? And we go to them and we tell them that they must bow in a way that we do not accept, that we don't give the example. That's failure. That's the failure of the new evangelization.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that, Pedro. And, it's interesting because I want to make sure I get the quote right. But I remember G.K. Chesterton saying something to the effect that, the point of the Catholic Church is not to tell me that I'm right when I think I'm right or know I'm right. And it's not the point of the Catholic Church of its existence to tell me I'm wrong when I know I'm wrong. He said the real crux of the Catholic Church's authority is this: to tell me when I'm wrong, when I think I know I'm right. And that's I was like, wow, that's very keen and sharp observation of him, because that takes a lot of prayer, humility, and to ask for God's grace and then participate and cooperate with that grace for more fuller conversion. But I appreciate that, Pedro, and I want to go on to my next question here. So you've been on, I recently watched you on Smart Catholic podcast on YouTube, which I absolutely love. I actually just discovered their stuff about maybe a week or two ago, and I've been watching the stuff with Mike Lewis, his interview with Smart Catholic, and then also your brief interview as well. And one of the things I want to talk about too is, you have an upcoming book on the Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia.
Precisely.
Without being, I guess, too redundant, because I know you've explained a lot too, but like, what led you to write this book?
It was precisely what I said before, right? We have been publishing several articles defending Amoris Laetitia, but I thought that at that point, I already had material to write a book, and some parts of the book it's not inspired, but okay, they are parts of the articles that I already mentioned and that have been repackaged, and some are completely new. The idea was to try to in a systematic way, refute all the arguments that have been given against the orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia. Stephen Wolfer's book already attempts that, but I wanted to just, pick this argument and that argument and that argument and that argument and try to refute them, at least all that I have knowledge of. As I said in Dominic's Smart Catholics interview, the book has 4 parts. The first part is an introduction about the magisterial weight of Amoris Laetitia, and how should a Catholic assent to it. There's lots of confusion about that. Recently, there have been in Catholic media and in social media, we read many people saying, "Oh, this is not infallible, so I can just, not." That's not how it works, okay? It never worked that way, but there have been some kind of anti-traditional notions on magisterial authority that have been promoted by people supposedly defending tradition. So I needed to dispel that. Okay, Amoris Laetitia is magisterial. This is the degree of magisterial weight that it has, and here is how the faithful are supposed to answer it, to respond to it. Then on the second part, I try, both from the document itself and from data outside the document, try to arrive at the most plausible interpretation for Amoris Laetitia. Because people say there are many interpretations and that they have this interpretation, that interpretation. So this is the most plausible interpretation for Amoris Laetitia. Even the Pope himself said this is the only correct interpretation. Third part, try to match Amoris Laetitia with several of the documents and magisterial pronouncements that the critics try to say they are contradictory with. I try with Trent, Familiaris Consortio, Veritatis Splendor, all of that, many documents. And on the fourth part, I try to give a practical example of how Amoris Laetitia should be applied, not just theory, but in practice, because people might say, oh, okay, that's how what it means. But in practice, how can it be applied? How should be applied in a way that is not laxist and is not rigorous at the same time, but is truthful to the spirit of the document. So this is the book, and it is currently being edited, and hopefully it will come out soon. And let's see.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to get my hands on that, and I look forward to that. I'll definitely probably devour it and underline and all that good stuff.
I like it very much.
Yeah, and so I appreciate your hard work on this. And what, this is my next question related to your book that's coming up. What impact do you want or wish this book to have?
Well, mostly, on the one hand, I wish that people who have doubts about the document, people who might have concerns about what they read online, that they might be more at ease, that they might find peace, because they will see that these arguments against the Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia are not correct. I hope that people might then start giving more a new chance to Pope Francis, and start becoming more suspicious, not of the Pope, but of the people who have been trying to turn them against the Pope. Maybe this can help turn the tide. I will not say that the book itself will turn the tide, but it can have a little contribution. On the other hand, I hope that people who really want to defend the Pope will find here the arguments to, stop the misinformation. We need, just like the misinformation was spread online, we need people online to stop spreading the misinformation. We are already a bit too late. There have been almost 5 years of misinformation going around, but we need to start, and the sooner we start, the better. Of course, what I wish is that people will stop doubting the orthodoxy of this document and allow it to shine forth as the beautiful document, as the life-changing document that it is. Because I said it before, and I'll say it again, Amoris Laetitia is one of the most important documents in church history, in recent church history. And of course, if it's so, the devil is trying to stop it, but he's not going to make it. So I need to be on the right side of it.
Yeah, it's funny because it makes me think of two things. One, in the classic passage from St. Matthew's Gospel in chapter 16, where it says, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But that doesn't mean that the gates of hell will not still try their hardest.
Yes, they will. They will try their hardest to keep that. It's always that. The more the thing is trying to move the world towards God, the more resistance it will have. That's it. That's obvious.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny because it's like the double-edged sword of the internet, with all of this wonderful opportunity for information, but then also this chance, because of human free will, for disinformation and misinformation. It's unfortunate, but it's part of being human.
It's the double edge of mankind itself.
Yeah, exactly. It just extends into this technological sphere, and
everything can be used for good and evil. We need to.
That's very true. And one of the things I want to talk about just briefly too is, one of the things I think that makes this different and causes more like concern for me, and I'm sure it does for you too, is that it almost seems like, well, not almost, I mean, in effect, we really have like this little Catholic civil war going on with Pope Francis, his defenders and his criticizers, his staunch dissidents, basically. Do you want to comment on that just briefly?
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's not even that civil war, but it's not even just two sides. There's the There's those who defend Pope Francis. There's those who criticize Pope Francis, but then there are those who go all the way into the extreme. And then there's those who do not go, oh, that's too much. But then I can criticize the Pope just the right amount. But what is the right amount? They cannot agree on that. That's the problem. But then, of course, there's also the dissidents on the left wing that they were already dissidents before, and they continue to be, even though they might find some solace and they try to defend Pope Francis because it's convenient for them. But one of the things that I actually say in the book is precisely this. I'm not saying that the conservative dissidents are better than the liberal dissidents. For me, dissent is dissent. But what is, it's a complete tactical error on the part of the conservative dissidents to actually reinforce this idea that Pope Francis is a liberal, because he's not. It would be more profitable for their position to try to refute the liberals when they say that Pope Francis is a liberal, than going around and saying and giving the arguments to the liberals, Pope Francis is a liberal. I told you that here is why Pope Francis is a liberal, because hello, Pope Francis is the Pope. He has the authority. So I think it's kind of counterproductive for them. They also have sawed the branch where they sit, because so the Pope's authority doesn't mean anything now. I mean, it's not that it doesn't mean anything, but you can just go on and criticize the Pope. You can make, initiatives against the Pope. You can sign petitions against the Pope. Okay. Now, when finally the supposed conservative Pope arrives, well, guess what? The other people are going to do exactly the same thing. What's to stop them? So it's a complete tactical error. If I'm not saying that they should be continue to be conservatives above being Catholics, but even if you want to, the course that they've been taking, it's not going to help them. And it's certainly not helping the church.
Yeah, I agree. And I appreciate that. So, I appreciate you saying that, Pedro. And one thing I want to ask you is, clarify maybe for the audience. So playing devil's advocate, maybe there's someone out there saying, well, so are you saying, Pedro, we can never criticize Pope Francis or the Pope, that he's beyond criticism? Are you saying that? And also talk about criticism of Pope Francis in general, in terms of like, where can we criticize the Pope? And is it a misinterpretation that you're saying we can't criticize him at all?
No, I'm not saying that. And it's something that people are always complaining about, where Peter is. First of all, where Peter is a website dedicated to defending Pope Francis. Okay, so you're not going to find there an article criticizing Pope Francis. You're going to find articles defending Pope Francis. Okay, it's not complaining that you're going for Pizza Hut and you cannot find a taco or whatever, okay? So it's just an example, okay? Yes, you can criticize the Pope, but first of all, in terms of doctrine, there are very specific limits. Even when we are not talking about infallible teachings, you are supposed to give submission of mind and will. Then there's this document that is Donum Veritatis. It applies to theologians, but maybe it can also apply to lay people. When you disagree what you should do, of course, the problem is what you should do is you try to agree with the church. You don't go around and say, "Oh, I'm the one who's right and the church is wrong." But sometimes you can't, and you find yourself, "No, I cannot get to say that the church is right on this topic." Okay, so you go to your superior, you talk with him about your concerns, and okay, you can still talk with the church about your concerns and prayerfully and patiently expect that someone will listen to your concerns, and the doctrine is not going to change, but it might develop in a way that will address your concerns. But what you should not do is go to social media or to the media and say, the church is wrong, the church needs to change. Okay, so that's precisely what people have been doing. You can criticize the Pope in matters of governance, okay, even though you must accept that he has the right to perform those acts of governance and acts of discipline and whatnot. Otherwise, that's infallibly defined in the First Vatican Council. You cannot deny that the Pope has that the right for those acts of governance. But that does not mean that those acts of governance will always be true or prudent. Here we are not talking about teaching, we're talking about prudence. You can. But the problem is, it's the attitude behind that criticism. Okay? We are supposed to, when we criticize the Pope, it's like the exception is not the rule, and it should be something that pains us, and it should be something like, I really love the Pope, but there's this thing, and I think that this thing is not the best, blah, blah, blah. What we find is people crowning themselves these mini popes of the internet, okay? And then when they're called out on it, you say, "Oh, you're saying I cannot criticize the Pope?" No, not like that. Okay, it's a matter of attitude. It's a matter of attitude. I don't see. They talk a lot about filial, being filial to the Pope. There's even that thing, the correctio filialis, filial correction to the Pope. But I don't feel any filial love for the Pope in their tone, I don't. Okay. I think this criticism is on a completely different level. It's in a completely different level. You're telling me, can't I criticize the Pope? Okay, until you get until you chill out a bit, or until you get a portion of your heart, maybe you shouldn't. Okay, just me. That's just my opinion.
Definitely. I definitely think there's a lot of wisdom and prudence and many priests have told me this when I was in my trad phase. They would be like, "James, close the laptop and go pray." Like that's what you
that's a lot of people.
And you know, I've been blessed because I love, full disclosure, I love the Latin Mass. I love the traditional rites. I love the Eastern rites, and I love the theology of all of that. But my view, just to sort of give just a brief synopsis, as I kind of alluded to before, I really see Pope Francis as a hermeneutic of continuity. Just like with you said you loved Ratzinger. I also love Ratzinger too, and I plan on reading more and more of his books. And of course. Yeah, he's amazing, and especially his stuff on ecclesiology and primacy, because reading about the papacy is what got me into the church, basically. And so, there's the famous Christmas address of his former Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, now emeritus, and he talked about the hermeneutic of continuity with Vatican II, and I say and agree with you too that we really need to have this towards Pope Francis as well, and it's someone I think too that is also a good example, and I think he's written for Where Peter Is too, if I'm not mistaken. But is the Catholic apologist Dave Armstrong has he written
for Where Peter Is? I would need to check.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I also like David Armstrong as an apologist as well, very much. We are good Facebook friends,
Mhm.
so yes, is also a good resource.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing I like about Dave, and also people like you've had on Dr. Robert Fasigi writing some articles there.
Fiji, correct?
Yeah, the thing I love about these two guys is that they both attend more traditional right parishes, but they're also very vocal about their defense of Pope Francis. And I really think we need more of that, especially
Yes.
as people that love the Vitus Ordo, the Latin Rite, or the
Yeah.
Latin Mass, and I'm also perfectly fine with Reverent Novus Ordo masses too. Like I have nothing against it. I actually prefer. I'm actually more preferential of like just. My main thing is like, can we just do Vatican II right? Everybody stop with all this craziness. Just do Vatican II right. But
Yeah.
but anyway, all that I know that could go on for forever, but I just wanted to say that and reiterate that and just appreciate everything you've said too. And I'll ask. So what I'll try to do is I'll finish up some questions about your book, and then we'll move on to your article, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
So and if you feel like you've answered these, then you can pretty much be brief as you want. But so how do you hope people will use this book that you've written, and what's the name of your book, and how can people get a copy of your book? When is it coming out? Like, what's the format? Like, will it be on Amazon and all that? So, and if you need me to repeat,
the title of the book is going to be The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia. It's going to be published by Whip Stock. As I said, we are still editing it, typesetting it, and whatnot. And all those details are going to be sorted out soon. But as soon as the manuscript is completely polished, so I cannot still answer that. But as soon as I do, I will put that out. We hope our objective is to have it out before the year of Amoris Laetitia ends, because we are currently undergoing a thematic year of Amoris Laetitia, and we want to contribute to the discussion and to the debate before that year ends. Yes.
Definitely, yeah. And so how do you hope that people will use this book? I know you touched before about what impact, but maybe it's the same, and you can sort of
it's kind of the same. It's for those who have concerns that they might read the book as a way to mitigate their concerns, that this book might address their concerns, and that they will, in fact, give another chance to Pope Francis. And for those who are in favor of Pope Francis, that they be properly, that they will know how to address the arguments that they may find online. Many people might not know. Basically, it's a resource book. It's an apologetics book. It's not a theology book. It's not trying to give be read in that way. It's mostly trying to refute the arguments against the orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia. It's trying to prove that Amoris Laetitia is orthodox. That's what I expect that people will get from the book, and that after reading my book, they will just go ahead and read Amoris Laetitia from end to end, or reread it with a new spirit, with a new perspective.
Definitely. And I recommend everyone, go out and get Pedro's book once it drops. And in addition, because I was about to say, I'm really happy because with books like from Stephen Walford and Matthew Levering, and of course going to the primary source and reading His Holiness himself in Amoris Laetitia, we're getting a little the little family is growing, and your book will add to that, and I think it'll be a great contribution. And in addition to the articles available,
and one of the things that I would like to address, because it's something that is very important, is that family of books is small. Yes, but it's not as small as you think. But the problem is that many resources, and my book benefits from that. Many resources are not in English. This confusion is very much started in this Anglo-American bubble, and then it overflowed to other media and to other countries. My Portuguese friends who were apologists before all turned against Pope Francis, but because they consumed this English-speaking media and these English-speaking arguments, whatnot. But if you go to discussions in Italian-speaking academics or discussions, Portuguese-speaking, Spanish-speaking, you find resources that are not accessible for many people, and it's a shame. It's a shame. There's this book from Rocco Buttiglione, Risposte Amichevoli, to the friendly answer to the critics of Amoris Laetitia. But it's in Italian. It's a book that complements the book from Stephen Walford very much. Now, and the fact that I am a Portuguese-speaking person and kind of intuitively can understand Spanish and Italian opened the doors for many resources that then are in the book. It's very important to make this bridge of those of that family that is not accessible to the English-speaking realm, because there's very good stuff out there, and even Vatican II. People might not know, but many of the best. If you go to American media, only now they are starting to address the arguments against Vatican II. Aaron's Word on Fire, whatnot, but they just started now. Brazilian Portuguese Brazilians, Portuguese speaking people have so many good resources on Vatican II already for several years, and they don't reach.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's impressive. Those people might think that it's all exhausted in the American media, but it's not. But since English is the lingua franca today, many things are not accessible to many people, and I hope that my language will help bridge this gap and bring new things to the English speaking people.
Yeah, I was about to say one of the things that kind of works against us too is that, like, I mean, most Americans, I mean, this is rapidly changing and will continue to change, but a lot of Americans, including myself, only know one language, and it's English. And there are, of course, definitely bilingual people here, of course, but usually it's Hispanic Americans that know more than one language, or it's other immigrants, or it's other people that have gone to school and studied other languages. And I'm kind of surprised about the Brazil thing because I mean, I don't know the statistics about this or anything like this, but I've met several people from Brazil who've come here, and they know English pretty well. And like from my understanding, they like are taught English in school too, so along with Portuguese and some other
Portuguese people too, since early age. And there's one thing that helps us is that we don't dub our movies like many of our brethren do. So that helps a lot. We are exposed to English, all that English media, movies, Hollywood, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It's all in English. Whereas my brothers here, my neighbors, in Spanish, they dub everything. So yeah, that helps. Also, another thing that helps is the structure of the language. A person who speaks Portuguese can speak Spanish almost intuitively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Period. We almost don't need to learn. It's a kind of like speaking with a different accent, even though it's a different language. But yeah, because the opposite does not happen. The Spanish cannot speak Portuguese intuitively, but Portuguese can do it with the Spanish for some reason.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense too historically, because you have all these, like, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, all these Romance languages that come from Latin.
They came from Latin. Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. And so now what I want to do for the remainder of our time together is I want to go ahead and share my screen real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is an article that Pedro wrote for Where Peter Is. This article really influenced me. It's probably my favorite article of yours, other than your series on the Pachamama scandal, which that could be another that'll be another episode. Just leave that little mine there. Does Amoris Laetitia contradict Familiaris Consortio? And you go through. You break it down. You go through the sacramental discipline. You go through the shift of emphasis. You go through the hermeneutic of continuity, which I think is like my favorite part. And then you go through the only rupture, which is really good. You kind of leave your mic drop there. I want to ask you, Pedro. First of all, just briefly, what is Familiaris Consortio for those who don't know?
Okay, so just like Amoris Laetitia is a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio is also a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. Saint John Paul II was the Pope that started this tradition of the synods. It was something that was called for by Vatican II, but John Paul II was the person who actually put it forward. And one of the first synods, if not the actual first, was precisely on the family, because the family was already in crisis at that time. And there was a synod in 1980, and in 1982, here comes a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, much like what happened with Amoris Laetitia. So these two documents have the same magisterial weight. They are both post-synodal apostolic exhortations. Of course, that the contents always can have more or less magisterial weight, but I'm talking about the document itself. The Familiaris Consortio basically said that divorced and remarried people should not get communion unless they lived as brother and sister. Okay, they did not leave Moris Auxorio. So now here comes Amoris Laetitia. Decades later, they discuss the same thing, and Amoris Laetitia on that footnote says that Catholics in irregular situations, divorced and remarried, they can receive communion if they have mitigating circumstances that diminish their subjective culpability. So people understood that these two contradicted each other. And the idea of this article and the idea of one of the chapters in my book is precisely to show that this is not the case. And one of the ways that I need to make that evident is that whether divorced and remarried people take communion or not, this is a matter of discipline. And we have to start making these distinctions, okay? Because there's a lot of commentary on magisterial weight and whatnot, and they don't make these crucial distinctions, okay? So doctrine cannot contradict previous doctrine. It can build upon it, can develop doctrine, but there should not be any contradictions. Otherwise, the church would have taught erroneously before, and then there's nothing preventing us from thinking that it might not be teaching erroneously now, or since the beginning, since the time of St. Peter. Now, but discipline does change. Discipline is something that has to do with church practice, and church practice must be grounded in sound doctrine, but practice may change according to the circumstances. Otherwise, we would still be practicing the same thing as the early church did, and we would not be celebrating in churches. We would be celebrating in the houses of each other, but we don't need to celebrate in the houses of each other because there's no persecution, at least not the way the Romans did. So the circumstances changed, the practices also change. Now, so discipline can contradict each other, and if you go to the past, if you go to study the church history, it has. There were people who were excluded from communion and who now are accepted to communion. For instance, in the early church, if a person had committed adultery, they had to perform a very hard penitential path until they could be accepted in the community again, until they could receive communion again. And nowadays, that person goes to confession, confesses, and then repents, of course, confesses, and can receive communion again. A traditionalist from the first century would say that we are moral laxists, okay? But no, it's just the way that we developed doctrine, and then our practices followed according to the circumstances. So one of the things that I theorize on the book, of course, I am not God, so I cannot say why God allowed the Holy Spirit to inspire one pope to one sacramental discipline, and then he inspired the other for another sacramental discipline. At least I do believe that they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. I can believe that. And I cannot know because I'm not God, but I theorize that in the 1980s, it was more crucial to, push back against all these attacks against the family. So the church needed to be firm and say, no, this is wrong, this is very wrong, and it has consequences, visible consequences. But now, the family has been completely corrupted by modern society, and now there are people who were born into this corruption. They were taught in this corruption. They lived in this corruption, and they commit errors, and now they want to come back to the church. And so we need to find ways to bring them back. We need to find ways to bring them back. So now, first, during the time of John Paul II, maybe it was time to fight the war, but now we need to set up a field hospital, which is a metaphor that Francis likes a lot, because now there are too many wounded. So maybe this is one theory. Of course, if we think outside the box for a minute, we can find other theories why this happened. But the fact that it has happened, the church in the 1980s found that it was needed to be like this, and now the church at this moment finds a need to implement a different discipline, and that's what happened. Okay, so now what people usually don't quite understand is that John Paul II taught a lot, and that's Veritatis Splendor, taught a lot about the objectively evil nature of sin. There are sins that are intrinsically evil, and they cannot never be justified ever. They are always evil, no matter what the justification that you do for them. But Pope Francis is talking about subjective culpability. So something is evil, but not all those who practice that evil are equally culpable. Okay? So these are two different things, and some people find the contradiction because they think that Pope Francis is trying to justify divorce and remarriage and adultery and what. No. Pope Francis never says that divorce is not okay. He never says that divorce is something that you can do. He says that not all people are equally culpable, and some people who are not culpable will need the help of the church and the help of the sacraments to be able to follow this demanding path that their faith imposes on them. Okay, so those are two completely different things, completely different planes. And Familiaris Consortio sets this discipline based on the objectively evil nature of divorce, whereas Amoris Laetitia sets its sacramental discipline based on the subjective culpability. For a person to receive the Eucharist, that person must not be mortal sin. Mortal sin has three components, and if one of those components is not present, it is not a mortal sin. First, it must be a grave matter. Divorce and remarriage with active sexual intercourse is grave matter, period. Okay, but that's not enough. A person must have full knowledge, full consent. That's where the mitigating circumstances that diminish subjective culpability may come in. So if this person has not full knowledge and does not have full consent, this person might not be in mortal sin and might receive communion. So why did John Paul II say that they could not receive communion? It's not because they were in mortal sin. It's because of some other justifications, like the possibility of scandal, like because what those pairs are doing is objectively contradicting the unity of Christ in the church that is signified by marriage. So those are not things regarding mortal sin. It is true that sinners who are in mortal sin cannot receive communion, but sometimes the church might impose restrictions on communion, even in those who are not in mortal sin. Was the case of John Paul II, but those restrictions can be lifted if later on someone finds that those restrictions are no longer needed. That's what happened. And that has happened several times before in the times of the church. There have been Eucharistic restrictions that were lifted afterwards, and that were imposed afterwards. We need a church, a living church. We are not a religion of just a book and the book says everything. No, we are a living church that needs to interpret the deposit of the faith at every single time, because at every single time there are new challenges, new ways. Now, this is not change in doctrine. Divorce is wrong. Jesus said that the union, the marital union, is indissoluble. No pope can go against that. But how do we treat people who have undergone that? Jesus, who said that divorce is always wrong, also went to the Samaritan woman and he asked her to drink. He went to her first while she was in sin, and he taught her, but he accompanied her. He said that it was wrong, but if you see, it's not the only thing that he did. He tried to establish a personal relation with her, and that was the most important thing, okay? So he probably got along better with that Samaritan woman than with the Pharisees that never got divorced. So this is also traditional. So that's the way how I try to make this continuity between Amoris Laetitia and Familiaris Consortio. I think that they are continuous. If you read the document, and for the book, I read the documents from end to end. I read Amoris Laetitia from end to end, Familiaris Consortio from end to end, Veritatis Splendor from end to end, the Newman's essay of development, of doctrinal development from end to end, because I like to read things in its proper context. And if you read Familiaris Consortio, and do not think not focus only on this thing of whether divorced and remarried can receive communion or not. You'll find many points of contact between Familiaris Consortio and Amoris Laetitia. And that's the hermeneutic of continuity that I wanted to explore and that I really enjoy to explore. It's one of my favorite things to find hermeneutic of continuity between present and past and present.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's great, Pedro. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it just makes me think of just this, not just like the hermeneutic of continuity, but also you mentioned St. John Henry Newman's essay, tying in the development of Christian doctrine with all of this. And, it's interesting too, because what you said made me think of Pope Francis and St. John Henry Newman, where of course, Pope Francis himself canonized St. John Henry Newman as a saint. So that goes to show what he thinks about him. But also, as you were saying, how the church is a field hospital. That makes me think of like different writings in St. Augustine, where he describes the church as a hospital for sinners. And it's interesting how Pope Francis puts this into this sort of field hospital, going out and with people. And then also too,
it's not just a hospital; it's a field hospital. We are in a battle, but there's a field hospital there. We are church militant in the proper sense of the word. In the proper sense of the word.
Yeah. It's not the vortex. But because that also makes me think too, because St. John Henry Newman has talked about how tradition is in, the play of lively minds, I think is the phrase that he has, and it's reflected upon, it's tossed in and out. And Bishop Barron has a great video on this, on doctrinal development and tradition and Pope Francis. That's another defender of Pope Francis I've really benefited from as well, as Bishop Barron. It's really excellent stuff. And then also, Pope Francis, has also spoken about just in Amoris Laetitia. It's just I love all the continuity between Saint Pope Paul VI on contraception and Humana Vitae, and Pope Francis is very firm on being pro-life. I mean, recently he said abortion is murder. Like, he just said that flat out. And so it's definitely not a liberal document. And as His Holiness goes on in the
Amoris Laetitia quotes Humanae Vitae, favored 6 times, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I was about to say I didn't know about the number of that, but yeah, that's really important and key, because and that's something I love about this book too, is that it just emphasizes how it's not really a liberal document. And Pope Francis's own comments on it is saying, as you said before, read it in full, read it in context, and read it with the judgment of charity. But not only that, but also our attitude should be, as Catholics, to the Pope, should be one of assent and listening and humility and so forth. And I think that's really, really important there. And also, I wanted to, so 2 things, because Pope Francis has talked about how, and he's gotten in trouble about this, where he's talked about the church, not only as a field hospital, but also that the church is not just this museum, that we're not curators of a museum, but and again, that he's not being anti-tradition, which is, Barron goes into that in some of his videos as well, where tradition is something that is living and organic and alive.
Tradition is living. Tradition is now. Tradition is, yes, the story of the church from St. Peter to the Vatican II Council, but Vatican II Council is tradition as well. John Paul II is tradition. Benedict XVI is tradition. Francis is tradition. Tradition is not bad. Tradition is living. And
definitely.
And just I would like to compliment just one thing, to say that one of the chapters of my book actually takes one document that is not very well known, and it has to do with Humanae Vitae, and it's a vademecum for confessors regarding the application of some principles of Humanae Vitae. And it has to do with couples that for some reason have difficulty putting Humanae Vitae in place, and how confessors must pastorally accompany them. And many of the things that Pope Francis uses on the divorce and remarriage are already being put in place in that vademecum for people who are not putting Humanae Vitae in practice. The parallels are not perfect, but there are some principles that are already being applied. And contraception, artificial contraception, is also an intrinsically evil act. It's also grave matter. So Pope Francis is not doing anything revolutionary. He's just applying principles that the church always had to a situation where those principles were not applied, at least since John Paul II. And that's okay, because John Paul II found it prudent to apply other sets of principles to that. Both sets of principles are Catholic, so both of them are at the disposal of the pontiffs to apply. It's not a contradiction of doctrine. It's just, a shift of emphasis. That's what I've been saying also in that article. It's sometimes the church needs to emphasize something, and sometimes the church needs to emphasize something else. People might think that the church is contradicting itself. No, the church is just getting different conclusions from different emphases of the same doctrine. That's continuity.
Yeah, man, that's great. I really appreciate that, Pedro. And if you don't mind, I want to just ask you, I know this is a little bit redundant, but I kind of want you to drill down on this just a bit, if you don't mind. Many people have taken Amoris Laetitia, especially in light of the fact how really what Pope Francis is doing, to oversimplify it, is what you said before. It's really an application and exercise of virtue ethics, an instantiation of that. But the critique from many Catholic traditionalists, outlets, and theologians even has been that Pope Francis is basically saying and teaching situational ethics or relativism in Amoris Laetitia. So do you want to kind of speak to that objection? I know you talked about it before.
That's also on the book, on the chapter about Veritatis Splendor. Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II lists a lot of errors of the age that contradict church the doctrine. They are incompatible with Catholicism. Situation ethics, relativism, individualism, subjectivism, proportionalism, consequentialism, fundamental theory ethics also. And I list all of those. And Amoris Laetitia is not that. Why? Because situation ethics, what is situation ethics? Is saying that the ethics of an act change with the situation.
Right.
Relativism says that ethics is relative. There's no set of ethics that you can apply to every single person. All of those have one thing in common, which is their conclusion that ethics of an intrinsically evil act can change so that an intrinsically evil act can be not evil sometimes. Pope Francis never says that, okay? And again, we're talking about different planes. Objective evil and subjective culpability, okay?
Right.
It's different to say that that an evil ceases to be an evil in certain situations, and saying that there are situations in which a person who commits an evil is not culpable of that evil, and so the consequences should be different. Those are two completely different things. And Veritatis Splendor also mentions situations of subjective culpability. Okay, so if Amoris Laetitia is situation ethics, then Veritatis Splendor is also situation ethics, because Veritatis Splendor already has this ethic of subjective culpability imbued in it, and not just Veritatis Splendor, Reconciliatio Penitentia. It's there since at least Trent, mortal sin, grave matter, full knowledge, full consent. No one has ever thought that just because someone has less culpability because does not have full knowledge or full consent, that somehow grave matter ceases to be grave matter. It doesn't. That's not situation. And I actually, in the book, I actually use an argument, an analogy, which is based on Evangelium Vitae from Pope John Paul II. There's a woman who decides to abort the baby because that baby is just inconvenient, for example. And then there's a teenage girl who has been raped by her stepfather and is forced by that stepfather to abort. Otherwise, she's going to be put on the street. Okay? Situation ethics would say that this teenage girl might be justified in killing the baby, just like, or they might even say that the first woman is also justified. Why not? But what we cannot, that's very different from saying that this teenage girl, even though she is performing the same evil in the sense that a baby is being killed, that's evil. But she's not culpable at all. She's being forced. The person who is culpable is stepfather, is the doctor is doing the procedure instead of giving her proper informed consent. So she's not being culpable. So she should not have the same consequences. Okay? So those are two completely different things. Am I saying that the killing of the baby on the second situation is wrong? Is less wrong? No, it's still wrong.
Yeah,
it's
still evil, still wrong. Yeah,
but we're talking about subjective culpability. Pope John Paul II says that in Evangelium Vitae. Culpability is not the same it's not the same on all situations, but abortion is intrinsically evil. Is Evangelium Vitae contradicting itself? If it's not, then Pope Francis is not contradicting itself either. These principles are traditional. The application of them to a specific set of sinners, the divorced and remarried, is the thing that is new, but the principles are there. They have always been there, and they will always be there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Pedro. It's so important to emphasize, the difference, as you said, between subjective culpability, mitigating factors and circumstances, and as Pope Francis himself affirms, and the Catholic Church affirms, that there is such a thing as intrinsically evil acts. And that is something I actually really love about Catholicism, because, for the life of me, because I had an atheist phase earlier during my conversion process, before I even came into the church. And I could never swallow relativism or moral relativism. I was like, no, evil exists. And especially because I love reading history, I was like, when I read about Auschwitz or Dachau, and things like that, I'm like, don't tell me that's not evil. Like that's evil. Like, I'm sorry, but it's like, I can't buy into this relativism thing where it's like, well, what the Nazis did was right for them, but wrong for us Westerners. I'm like, no, it was just wrong.
No one's a relativist when that person is being hit on the street. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah,
or
definitely.
when that person is being exploited, or when that person is being wronged, no one is a relativist. So
yeah, exactly. I think deep down our inner core, I think we know at like an epistemic level, and it's really this distortion of modernism and postmodern thought that gets us in trouble intellectually.
That's a law inscribed in our hearts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so, man, Pedro, I've really appreciated this. And I guess the last question I'll ask you for today is, what is the only rupture between Familiaris and Amoris Laetitia that you mentioned in your article?
Yeah, that's the mic drop. Okay. So, well, it's the rupture is not. This is just like a little clickbaity. The rupture is not from Francis to John Paul II. The rupture is from the critics of Francis to John Paul II, because John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio is also very clear that we need to think with the church, with the magisterium. In fact, I can't even fathom how people can use these documents, these magisterial documents, these authoritative documents, to say that, they contradict Pope Francis, so we can just disregard Pope Francis. Well, all these documents, Veritatis Splendor, Trent, and not only those that contradict Amoris Laetitia, supposedly, and Saint Pius X, First Vatican Council, they put Francis against those documents and say Francis contradicted these documents, so I can disobey Francis. When these documents are filled with appeals to fidelity, to the magisterium, to religious authority, you cannot put Familiaris Consortio against Amoris Laetitia or Familiaris Consortio against Pope Francis, because Familiaris Consortio says the magisterium, you need to be faithful to the magisterium. Veritatis Splendor says you have to be faithful to the magisterium. So what are people doing? Using those documents to attack the magisterium. It's crazy. So that's the only rupture. Since they are part of the church as well, they are entering into rupture with Familiaris Consortio. When Familiaris Consortio, Familiaris Consortio leaves the path open for new discernment phases. They said Familiaris Consortio appeals to the people on the ground to find ways to accompany these people. And the Familiaris Consortio is also clear that the process is not closed. So what are people doing saying that the process after 30 years cannot keep going because they have concerns, because they think that Pope Francis is the Antichrist? That this is a perversion of these documents. It's a perversion of tradition. You cannot pit documents against documents. Leo the 13th already said that. You cannot pit documents against documents. That's not the way. It's like the Protestants trying to use the Bible against the church. You cannot separate the Bible from the church. You cannot separate the document from the authority that compiled that document, that gave that document the authority. It's crazy. You cannot do that. Simply, it's a vain effort. Might as well read them all in the proper context. If you have doubts, let's try to find a hermeneutic of continuity. If you still cannot find that hermeneutic of continuity, if you're not convinced by it, there are ways to ask your superior about it, to try to put your concerns out there. It's not what we have been seeing. It's not what we have been seeing.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And just for everyone out there, I know I keep referencing these books, but Matthew Levering, what Matthew Levering and also Stephen Walford do is basically what you just said. They take, because to be honest, one thing that I found kind of hard at first with defenders of Pope Francis was that continuity was more often assumed than it was actually proved post. What's the opposite of a priori, posteriori, or whatever?
Posteriori.
Yeah, so it was actually proved more empirically in works of Levering and Walford, and now your works, because it is so important, I think, to recognize that traditional documents such as Trent, such as Vatican I, such as writings on marriage and indissolubility from Popes Leo the 13th and Pope St. Pius X, who is as traditional as you can get. Oh, I'm sorry?
Pius the 11th, Casti Connubii.
Yeah, and Pius the 11th. And so you have, I really appreciate both Walford and Levering taking those pre-conciliar, pre-Vatican II documents and then synthesizing it with Benedict and St. John Paul II and the post-Vatican II conciliar period, and then, of course, with Pope Francis in the modern instantiation of the present day in the 21st century, where we find ourselves in our present context. And so I just think that's really important, really beautiful. Pedro, I just really appreciate everything, your work, all that you do. And, where can people where can they, if they have any questions, where can they get in contact or get in touch?
Since now I'm starting to get published, I am setting a website now, both for my apologetics and for my fiction writing. It's still, it's almost done. It's almost done. I think that people can already go for it if they want. PedroGabrielWriter.com. And if they want, and I'm also around on social media. As an oncologist, it's kind of difficult to be in touch right at the moment, but whenever I can, I try to be available.
Yeah, definitely. And anything else you want to plug in terms of like what's coming up with Where Peter Is at all?
At this moment, we're just doing what we have been doing until now.
Yeah.
Let's keep reading where Peter is, and stay tuned. I hope that I will have news about the book soon.
Definitely. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in, and thank you very much, Pedro. I've been honored and privileged to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. And this has been episode 6 of James Interviews series. I'm your host, James Stoffinger Jr., and this was the episode interviewing Pedro Gabriel on his upcoming book, The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, and his article on Familiaris Consortio and Amoris Laetitia, whether or not they contradict one another. All right, everyone, stay tuned for more episodes coming up down the line. We'll have some more people on. Definitely looking forward to some stuff that's coming out there. So good night, everyone, and God bless.